Hello and good evening. Oh, that was terrible. Mainly because people were still talking. Hello and good evening. Thank you. So I missed you last week. I missed you a lot. And I'm glad that I am back now. So, students. Actually, this one is for students and general public. Not to start on a sad note, but it's so sad when our projector people have to see so many people on their laptops looking at Facebook while these lectures are happening. So once again, I would like to make a plea that if you have your computers out, please be taking notes for the class. And I would also like to say, students, we've been sending out a lot of emails about your attendance and about passing or not passing this class based on your B-Space papers. One of the things I've noticed is that your responses on B-Space are incredible. They're thoughtful, they're detailed, and I'm going to be picking a couple of them every week to share with you. I'm not going to start that this week, I'm going to start that next week, but I just wanted to prep you for that so that all of us can get the benefit of the wonderfulness that's on B-Space. Now, there's also plenty of students in this class that have extracurricular activities, and you've been very diligent about sending me emails so that the rest of the class can know about them. So I wanted to tell you about the Local, which is an on-campus produce stand that buys all its produce from the farmer's market and resells it on Sproul Plaza at no profit. The Local is one of those healthy, sustainable ways for you to get fresh food on campus. So please go to Sproul Plaza and shop there. Yeah! The next one is a personal favorite of mine, the Berkeley Student Food Collection. Or no, the Berkeley Student Food Collective. Now, can everybody stand up who has spent time with the Berkeley Student Food Collective, volunteered? I heard there's quite a few students. Everyone who's done that, stand up. Give these students a hand. They have a student-run cooperative market and educational center located at 2440 Bancroft Way. And on Friday, November 18th, they will be having their 3rd annual Harvest Gala. So please go to foodcollective.org/gala for more details. Now, this third announcement for students, it is required to screen Food Inc. as a part of this class. We will be having 2 screenings. If you can't make one of the screenings, it's okay, but that means you have to view it yourself. So the first screening is on October 24th from 7 to 9 p.m. in 120 Latimer. Who will be attending that one? Please press A on your clicker if you will be attending that one. Oh, I'll give you all the dates and then you can choose. Yes, how about that? So the second one is Wednesday, October 26th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. So if you can make October 24th, press A on your clicker, and if you can make October 26th, press B on your clicker. Give you the times again. Okay, last time. October 24th. That is a Monday. Monday, October 24th from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. is the first one. The second one, Wednesday, October 26th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. If you can make the first one, press A. If you can make the second one, press B. And if you will be screening it at home, you can press C. We want to know this just so we know roundabout how many students are going to be coming to each. Okay? Great. Now, this week, what we are doing in this class, Raj Patel is a personal friend of mine, because when I transitioned into the food movement, I went from Green for All in Oakland, California, yay, to Slow Food USA in Brooklyn, New York, yay, and really wanted to learn more about the global food system and what was happening internationally, because I'd been hearing some scary things. So Raj Patel wrote a book called Food Rebellions in collaboration with Eric Holt Jimenez at Food First, and it was an edited collection of stories, case studies, and a description of the global food economy. That book, that's the longest book I have ever read. Not because it's actually a long book, but because it is so thick, full of information. Every paragraph I had to put my head down and absorb for a second. So part of why I say this is because this man is really smart. And if you can actually absorb what he's talking about tonight, your mind will be blown. He also has the added benefit of being very funny and extremely entertaining to watch. So you are really in for a treat. And now, who is Raj Patel? He's a writer, activist, and an academic. He has worked for the World Bank and the WTO and protested against them around the world. He is currently a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley's Center for African Studies, an Honorary Research Fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Yeah, I got that right. And he is also a fellow at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First. Please give a warm round of applause to Raj Patel.
Hello. They have us tethered now so that we don't float away. Good evening. We have about 40 minutes to talk about everything. And by everything, I mean everything. We're going to talk about the global food system. And so in the next 40 minutes, what I want to do is tell you what it is and why it is responsible for us living in a world where there are 1 billion people, more or less, who are undernourished, and 1.5 billion people who are overweight. Now, there used to be a time where being overweight was a sign of wealth, where if you were portly and slightly pudgy, you were in command of a great many resources and in command of your time sufficiently that you didn't have to exercise by working, and therefore you were able to accumulate an extra pound or two. These days, however, being overweight and being undernourished are 2 points on a continuum of poverty. If you are undernourished, the chances are that you are living in the global south, and the chances are that you are in rural areas, and the chances are that you are a woman or a girl. 60% of the people going hungry today are women or girls, 60% of people who are undernourished. In the United States, we have not so much a problem of undernourishment, but we certainly have food insecurity. In the United States, we have nearly 50 million people who, at some point during last year, didn't know where their next meal was coming from. And the group that was most likely to be food insecure were female-headed households. 35% of US households, so female-headed US households were food insecure. They didn't know where their next meal was coming from. Now, how do we get to a position where the hungry, the people who are overweight and people who are undernourished are 2 points on the same continuum? Well, in order to understand this, other people, I believe, use PowerPoint, but I like to kick it old school and encourage you to use your imaginations. If you can imagine, for me, an hourglass, so wide at the top, narrow in the middle, and wide at the bottom. Wide at the top, narrow, and wide. At the top, there are the millions of farmers around the world who grow food for us. And at the bottom, there are the nearly 7 billion people who try to eat every day if we can. But in the middle, there are just a handful of corporations that run the global food system. In other words, a handful of corporations that worry about the truck and barter of goods from farm to fork. And in any major commodity globally, there are about 4 or 5, possibly 6 corporations that control the majority of the market, the global market in that commodity. So, for example, the global packaged tea industry is 95% run by one corporation, by Unilever. But the global grain trade is run by the ABCD of global grain trading companies, Archer Daniels Midland and Bunge and Cargill and Dreyfus. So in every major market, you have a few corporations concentrating that power. And when they concentrate that power, they do what corporations ought. They maximize shareholder value. They're in the business of making profit, and you do that by buying cheap and selling dear. And when you buy cheap in the agricultural world, that means you pay your workers as little as you can, and you pay as little as you can for the inputs, for the food itself. And that goes some way to explaining why it is that even in the United States, when you look at people who are the poorest paid in this country, the people who are living in conditions of slavery-like conditions, say in southern Florida, you'll find that they are in the agricultural labor. And that problem, of course, is much deeper in the global south. But on the other hand, these corporations are also in the business of adding value to the extent that they can, and getting us to eat food that is profitable. And of course, that means eating food that is rich in the salt and the fat and the sugar. And so what you have, particularly in countries like ours and in Europe, if you look at the income and obesity correlations, you find that it is the rich increasingly who are whose body mass index approaches normal, and it is the poorer you get, the more likely you are to be overweight. And so poverty is a sign of having insufficient funds to be able to control your diet in a way that leads you to be able to access good, clean, healthy, fair food. But of course, you have corporations behaving badly, you have them skirting the law, you have them underpaying their workers, you have them bribing government to be able to get large subsidies, you have them doing all these things. And we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised that corporations commit capitalist acts. That's what they do. In fact, if a CEO weren't in the business of being able to squeeze that extra dollar or $1 million out of Congress, if a certain firm weren't in the business of trying to undermine the Environmental Protection Agency, that CEO would be out on their ear for failing to generate the kind of shareholder value that he is legally, or she occasionally is legally required to do. So the interesting question is not why do corporations behave badly. We kind of said it. We set the rules of the game up that way. The interesting question is, why do we have global markets in food at all? That's the interesting question. And global markets in food are fairly new. The first real sort of global market in food was only completed at the end of the 19th century, and it was really engineered by the British. Now, the British went to, the British were interested in having cheap food to feed the workers in Manchester and Liverpool, workers in the workshop of the world. And what they wanted was access to cheap wheat. And it just so happens that India, and particularly the grain basket of the Punjab, was a great place for growing wheat. Now, Punjab, until the British came along, was largely a sort of feudal setup. And what that meant was that you had land that was sort of taken over by landlords. You have landlords, and you have peasants working on the land. And it's a lousy setup, right? Because the peasants sort of toil away, and then they give their surplus to the the landlord, and then the landlord gives it back just enough for the peasants to survive. It's pretty crappy. The only bright side in feudalism is this, that in a bad year, it is the landlord's responsibility to feed the peasant. It's called a moral economy, that there is between lord and serf this idea that if things go wrong, the lord has some responsibility towards peasants. So when there is a bad year, the landlord will make food available, will open up the granaries. Now, the British came along and they saw this and they said, well, look, landlords, we the British have an idea for you. If you forget this idea of giving away free food to peasants, you don't need to do that. We have a much better idea, and it's called markets. And you will find out, stay with us here, what you need to do is introduce these markets. And so what you do is pay peasants for their labor, and you'll use as much labor as you need. And then you'll be able to produce much more of your crop. And then it gets better, because then we'll buy it from you, and we'll ship it back to Britain, because we have people who'd like it there, and you'll become rich, and it'll be fantastic. Win-win-win. And the landlord said, no thanks. And the British said, no, we have guns. And so it was that, I mean, it was a little bit more complicated than that, but basically the idea was that actually through violence, but through also a certain sort of degree of good intent. The British genuinely thought that they were bringing progress by bringing the cutting edge in economic theory of markets and international trade to the Indians. And to some extent, of course, the British didn't lie. By bringing these international markets in food, they found India produced more grain than it ever had in its history. Millions of tons of grain grain were being exported from India every year at the end of the 19th century. But when you introduce markets in food, you introduce two very simple rules. The first rule is that if you have money, you get to eat. Even if you're halfway around the world, if you're connected by the market to a food supply, your dollars or pounds in this case will be able to shift food from the grain basket of India all the way to Manchester. But if you don't have money, and this is the second rule, if you don't have money, then you starve. And that's what Indians who had been turned into a rural labor force found. That even at the height of India's grain production, millions of people were starving. The historian Mike Davis has done some incredible work on this, and I recommend his book, Late Victorian Holocausts, to you all. It's not a very cheery title, but it's a brilliant book. And what he found was that there was a moment, for example, where the British were surprised. They'd come to India with these great visions of social change and progress, and they were slightly appalled to find that since they arrived, in the 120 years of British rule, there had been 31 serious famines since they arrived. And that contrasted with 17 famines in the previous 2 millennia. So break it down for you. I mean, under sort of this feudal system, appalling feudal system, there was a famine once every century, more than once. I mean, it was less than once a century. But when the British arrived, there was a famine with the regularity of an election cycle, once every 4 years. So this is the kind of progress. This is the kind of the vision that stitched together various parts of the world, and this is really the basis of the modern international trade system. And India is sort of ground zero for this yet again. India is a country where, I mean, when you hear of India in the newspapers these days, India is the place where, everyone is, when you phone the gas company, someone in India will answer. Everyone in India has PhDs in computer science, and you have people on the sidewalk sort of mending computers with chisels. But of course, India is an incredibly poor country. When I was growing up, people said, eat your greens, there are children. Well, my parents said, eat your greens, there are children starving in Africa. What do you think parents in Africa say? Parents in Africa say, eat your greens, there are children starving in India. And they are right. There are more children starving in just 5 Indian states than there are in the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa. And that's not a story you hear. A story you don't hear is that 1 in 6 of the world's farmers is Indian. And the stories that matter to them are about agriculture, about hunger, about the schemes that have been variously tried on them to be able to improve their output. And we can and we probably should talk about the Green Revolution in questions. But I guess what I want to observe is that there have been a sort of package of measures that have been dumped on Indian farmers, particularly since the early 1990s. And this is a package of measures that basically they are neoliberal, which is to say that they are about shrinking the state and bringing the free market in. India, until the early 1990s, was a fairly closed economy. In other words, it wasn't open to the winds of international trade. Tariffs were very high. Government spending, there was a great deal of the role of the state in agriculture and in food. And after the beginning of the 1990s, this all changed. The man who is now Prime Minister of India was then the Finance Minister, Manmohan Singh, and he had a vision of neoliberal policies raising up India. And so he reduced the amount of money that was going to be spent in rural areas. He cut back on the amount of money that was going to be given to farmers and invested in farmers. He cut back on the amount of money that would be spent on on urban food programs and entitlement programs, and it opened up the economy to any foreign investor or any foreign corporation that wanted to come in. And this had some fairly disastrous consequences. India is one of the homes of incredibly high rates of farmer suicide. and you see those rates increasing. I mean, the stories of farmer suicide that you hear in India aren't just, aren't particularly Indian. I mean, they're always stories that have the same kind of background. They're stories about how a farmer wants to improve the land so that they can leave it, and it's usually he, can leave something better to his kids. And so he'll borrow money from the only place he can, the local moneylender, and the local moneylender charges interest at the rate of doubling the amount you have to repay every month. It's an incredibly high rate of interest, but the farmer takes the money because there's no other choice, and this is there's a firm belief that everything's going to turn out okay. So you borrow the money and you drill for you try and irrigate your land, for example, and there's no water, and so now you find yourself in deep debt. And what do? You borrow again to be able to double down on this bet, and you drill, and again there's no water, and so now you're deep in debt and you don't know what to do. And in India, at least in some of the families I visited, there were people waited until these men waited until the wife and kids went to bed, and then they pull down a packet of pesticide that is Forate, for example, is a pesticide that's not sold in the United States because it's illegal, but it's sold by US corporations in India. And one of the farmers I talked to mixed it with water and drank it, and he can't have convulsed very hard because he died without waking his wife and 2 kids over a sum of money that was $325 US. Now that's that kind of story is one that's told over and over again in India, but actually it's not a terribly Indian story. It's one that you can find told in the United Kingdom. You can find it told in Australia, and of course you can find it told here in the United States, in the Midwest, in the 1980s. When farmers who were on the verge of bankruptcy, who'd mortgaged the land, who were deep in debt, faced the threat, as farmers around the world do, of losing the land that had been in their families for generations. And so, rather than choose to lose the land that had been, that had defined their family, they chose to take their own lives. Leaving families struggling incredibly hard to cope. Now, that story is one that's true of India. It's also true that levels of hunger for India's poorest have been rising until they protested and demanded change, and actually recently won that. And we can talk about that in questions if people are interested. But India is also home to, very recently, India's richest men, they're all men, appeared in the Forbes billionaires list. In fact, 4 of the top 10 richest men in the world a couple of years back were Indian, more than any other country, because they'd been able to take advantage of all this money going into the country once it had been opened up. And India was also home, and it is now home, to the world's largest number of people with type 2 diabetes. And I mean, in a sense, I could have told them this for nothing. I mean, I'm British Asian, so my family has been struggling with what passes for the Western diet for a while, and so we've been exposed to it, and now there isn't a man in my family who's over 50 who isn't pricking his finger and checking his glucose in honor of the Western diet. Every British Asian family that I know struggles with blindness associated with diabetes, with cardiovascular disease, with amputation, and of course premature death. And this is starting to be, in Britain, by the way, the rates of diabetes among British Asians is about 20%. But in India, in rural areas, it's like 3%. But in the slums, it's 13%. In most Indian cities now, it's 14% and climbing. And this is in part because of changes in diet due to the influx of these of companies selling salt and fat and sugar. India, until the 1990s, didn't have Coke or Pepsi. India had a local brew called Thumbs Up. Has anyone here tried Thumbs Up? Click A on your thing. No. Does anyone? I don't know. Anyway, no, Thumbs Up is terrific. It tastes nothing like anything you've tried before, but it's lovely. It's beetle nutty. But all of a sudden, Coke and Pepsi come in. And Coke come in with their global Coke advert, the polar bear. Do you remember this polar bear advert? You know, the polar bear, you know, the sort of polar bears waddle along and they find Coke and then they lop the top of the bottle of Coke off, and you know, there's no opposable thumbs, but they do it anyway. And they glug and they drink, and they look up at the northern lights. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Indian cultural iconography, but polar bears are not big in India. The northern lights, people know. So you know, there are a billion people watching this on television going, what the fuck's that? Pepsi, on the other hand, nailed it. They hired the Bollywood A-list to tell, you know, to sing and dance about how amazing Pepsi was. And so it was, Pepsi, Pepsi, Pepsi. Oh yes, I throw down. So they had Pepsi, and you know, Pepsi now is a sort of major vendor of salt and fat and sugar in India. But it was like aliens versus Predator. I mean, you know, whoever won in that battle, Indians lost. And that's, I mean, that gives you a sense of the kinds of battle in which we find ourselves when it comes to the global food system. These mighty corporations are struggling for to get every penny that, you know, that is available to them, and they're not caring terribly much about the health consequences, despite what one reads. I mean, obviously there's a certain sort of PR weakness that you find with a lot of these firms. So you know, when people appealed to the Coca-Cola company, for example, to make their, you know, to saying, look, Coke isn't very good for you. You know, it can dissolve teeth, and it does all these horrible things, and you put Mentos in it, and you do all, and the Coca-Cola company said, well, no, that's fine, that's fine. We at the Coca company have something for you. What we're going to do, we're going to take the sugar out, and then we're going to add vitamins, and then we're going to call it Diet Coke Plus, and this is what everyone needs to drink. And Diet Coke Plus is the food industry's response to some of the, you know, to some of the outcry around the failure of the food industry to provide healthy and nutritious food. Diet Coke Plus. So you can drink Diet Coke. It's Diet Coke with vitamins, and that apparently is going to solve the problems that we face in the world today around hunger and obesity. Now, you know, there's something that's worth, you know, of that kind of deep failure to get it that you can find in other domains. So, for example, there's a sort of a new trend in the debate around genetically modified crops, and again, we can talk about this more in questions if you like. That says, look, around the world today, there are 1 million kids who are going blind because of vitamin A deficiency. And what we can do is fix that by genetically engineering crops. You know, what we're going to do is solve this vitamin A deficiency, which everyone agrees is awful, and we're going to fix it by adding vitamin A into rice. And this was the promise of something called golden rice, which was regular white rice, but spliced with genes from carrots to be able to produce this golden beta-carotene, this vitamin A. And so they tried it out, and the development specialists drove through villages in Southeast Asia, mainly with their jeeps, saying, "We have something terrific for you. This will solve vitamin A blindness. Just plant this, and everything will be great." So they tried out, and the first round, of course, is tough because it's, in order to get your recommended daily allowance, you need to eat 50 bowls of golden rice. So then they come back with version 2.0, which is only 2 bowls of rice, and then you got to think, well, you know, what's wrong with, you know, fixing this problem of hunger and malnutrition by engineering vitamin A into rice? And the problem, well, I mean, there are two things that are kind of weird here. I mean, you know, in the same way that it would be I mean, the reason that kids are going blind is not because they suffer a deficit of vitamin A in their rice. It's because the only thing that they can afford to eat is rice. You don't fix vitamin A blindness by just tweaking rice. You fix vitamin A blindness and a range of other things by fighting poverty. But vitamin A golden rice doesn't fix that. And in any case, the problem is that in Asia, golden rice is considered an inferior good. If it's golden, it's not white rice. And people like white rice. And there are cultural preferences that need to be respected that completely aren't when you're offering golden rice and telling people golden rice the way forward. I mean, it's like someone came to the United States and said, look, we have this amazing bread, and it'll help you, help tide you through some of the deficiencies that this recession is going to wreak on your bodies. And the only thing about this bread is that it's blue. And all of a sudden, blue bread for the poor in America. Because that'll help keep them straight. Of course, you can understand that there's something quite abhorrent about that. And yet when it's done to brown people, it's okay. And I think one ought to bear in mind that there is this kind of inbuilt prejudice when it comes to thinking about, well, if they're poor in developing countries, they'll be fine with it. Because actually, cultural preferences matter a great deal. And I actually do think if someone wants to ask questions about that towards the end of the talk, we should. But what I want to do is sort of think about not how entrenched this global food system is, for it is, but what we can do about it. And there are a number of ways in which we are induced to behave. I mean, we're encouraged, for example, to go into supermarkets and to buy something that says fair trade and shade grown and dolphin-friendly, tuna-compatible, pro-grasshopper, no small bits of children's fingers. And of course, the minute you step into a supermarket is the minute you step into the food system's ground zero. The world's largest employer is Walmart. If you look down the list of the world's largest employers, 3 of the top 10 are supermarkets. These are massive entities in the global food system that are really that control the food system in ways that we haven't seen really in a very long time. Not since the British East India Company have we seen this kind of level of control of the food system from farm to fork, as the way that supermarkets are now starting to write and engineer legislation. But I guess the problem for me is the idea that we can shop our way out of this. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I buy fair trade coffee, right? But the reason I buy fair trade coffee is because I care about what farmers want. And if you care about what farmers want, why not ask them? And so I was at a recent World Fund for Agricultural Development conference, and there was this sort of impromptu survey of farmers groups. And it was put to them, so what would you like? Here's a sort of list of things, including fair trade, and just rank them in order. Whatever you want most, rank number 1, and fair trade, rank that way you will. And so the number 1 thing that farmers want is land reform. And the number 2 thing that farmers wanted at that conference was access to water. The number 3 thing that farmers wanted was access to sustainable technology. The number 6 thing that farmers wanted was fair trade. Now, of course, that ought to give us pause when we think, we're going to solve everything by shopping. No, you can't get land reform by shopping for it. There's no label for land reform on something when you go into the supermarket. We can't get access to water by shopping for it. You can't get access to sustainable technology by shopping for it. That's not to say we shouldn't do these things, but it means that we need to think of ourselves much more than as consumers. We need to think of ourselves as political agents in the food system. And that's something that a range of groups around the world are doing. I could talk about slow food, but I imagine that's something that's come up a few times. That's right, of course. And but did Carlo mention the roots of slow food?
Not really.
This is fun. Here's something that the bad rap that slow food gets about being the sort of middle-class supper club, right? We hear this bad rap from time to time. Now, what's very interesting about Carlo is that he was to the left of the Italian Communist Party. When he started, he's a man of very deep political conviction and deep political roots. He's been organizing for a very long time in order to make sure that people have good, clean, and fair food. What are the 2 things you need to have good, clean, and fair food? You need time and you need money. And so he was part of political organizing in order to make sure that agricultural workers, remember the poorest paid people in any country, agricultural workers were unionized and were paid better wages. And then that they had a 2-hour lunch break to be able to enjoy their food. Slow food was never just about, that everyone, just a few people must be allowed to have fine olive oil. It's about a deep understanding about who deserves pleasure. And the answer to that question is everyone. And so in order for everyone to have pleasure, we need to change the way that our society works and the way our economy works, so that everyone has the time and the money to enjoy good food. And that radical democratic moment in slow food isn't just to be found in Italy, but it's to be found in a range of countries. And I guess I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. So I'm going to just end with really one of the movements that I find most inspirational. And it's a movement called La Via Campesina. Because they have, I know that food sovereignty was on some of your reading lists this week. And La Via Campesina came up with this idea of food sovereignty because they were pushing back against these neoliberal policies. Neoliberal policies that were introduced by groups like the World Bank. Actually, ought I to explain the World Bank? Should I do that World Bank thing? Do people know the World Bank thing? You've done the, yeah, I know you don't do the World Bank thing. I'm going to do the World Bank thing. For those of you who haven't heard this, and I know most of you have now, actually, really, who's heard the World Bank thing?
Do the World Bank thing.
I'll do the World Bank thing. Thank you. I feel like I'm allowed. So the World Bank thing. Those of you who don't know about the World Bank and who don't understand these neoliberal policies, think about the Terry Gilliam film Time Bandits. Those of you who haven't seen it, it's a film about the universe, about the creation of the universe. As we know, the universe was built in 6 days, so it was a rush job. And God had help, but he didn't treat his workers very well. So those, there are holes in the universe, and these disgruntled workers jump through the various holes in the universe, robbing people. And so in one scene, they rob Napoleon, and they jump through a hole in the universe, and they end up in Sherwood Forest, where they are met by Robin Hood, who's played by John Cleese. He's a British upper-class actor, and he plays Robin Hood as an upper-class twit. Hood is wearing this big green hat and introduces himself as Hood. And so Hood's very excited to see all Napoleon stuff, and he says, well, thank you very much indeed. The poor will love this. Have you met the poor? They're charming people. Of course, they don't have 2 pennies to rub together, but that's because they're poor. Well, let's give this stuff away. Bring on the poor. So the poor are brought on. This line of disheveled people are brought on. Hood works the line. A gilded mirror for you. Yes, jolly good. Well done. And how long have you been poor? Jolly good. Yes. And then next to Hood is this big bloke who takes whatever Hood has given and punches the poor person in the face. So that's how the World Bank works. That's the essence of the, and the reason that's like the World Bank is for a number of reasons. I mean, in part it's because the World Bank is this bank, it's giving away things and it's taking them back. It's also because the World Bank comes with the punch in the face of these neoliberal economic policies that reduce the amount of money that's given to farming, that put farmers at the winds of the free market and allow their the global firms to actually sort of take advantage of them. But it's also this sort of sanctimonious approach of, have you met the poor? We had lunch with the poor yesterday. They love us. And in fact, that misrepresentation of the poor is integral to the way that the World Bank works. It needs to be able, folk at the World Bank aren't sort of bald villains sitting in, not all of them. Most of the people at the World Bank are not bald villains sitting in leather chairs, stroking white cats, going, we have destroyed the global South. a lot of people, I mean, they're feeling like, we do this because it's the right thing to do, and the theory, drives us this way, and we try to be as accountable as we can. The trouble is that a lot of movements in the global south experienced these policies being dropped in their laps, and said, had their hands up saying, actually, we have better ideas, and we want to hold you to account, and we want to change the way this works. And the World Bank ignored them. And so they mobilized internationally. And this is how Via Campesina was formed. La Via Campesina, the peasant way, is now a group of over 200 million farmers, farm workers, and landless people from the global south. And they developed this idea of food sovereignty as a way of bringing back into the equation a conversation about power. Because food sovereignty is this idea that communities ought to have power over the way that their food system is run. And again, for those of you who've done the reading, I mean, to remind you that this is a systematically vague concept. There's a lot about, when you say communities need to be able to be in charge of the way their food and agriculture systems are run, what does that tell you about what the food policy is going to be? I mean, are we going to have local markets? Are we going to have, permaculture? Are we going to have, and we could have many of these things, but it's up to the community to decide. But before the community can decide, we need to make sure that everyone in the community can decide. And that's why one of the slogans around food sovereignty is that food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. Food sovereignty is about an end to all forms of violence against women. And this violence is not just, it's not just the horrific domestic violence that women globally are subject to and survivors of, but it's also about the structural exploitation of not being able to take to sell your product in the market because the European Union or the United States is dumping theirs. The structural violence of not being able to send your daughter to school because she is required to work in the fields or to take care of the kids while you work in the fields. And these kinds of power relations need to change. If we're going to have a democratic conversation, we first need to make sure that there is equality so that we can have that democratic conversation. And this seems to me, this seems to me very interestingly kind of what's going on with the Occupy movement here I was at the Occupy movement in New York on the first night, and I just didn't get it. Because there were a lot of people who were worried about the police coming and smashing them up, and they didn't know what they were doing. And I'm like, well, you don't know what you're doing. And on the first night of a food sovereignty event, that's what it would look like, right? I mean, it's all about making sure that you have the space so that then you can start deciding what the politics are. And Via Campesina spent 3 years getting this idea of food sovereignty together. And Occupy is being castigated for not knowing what they want just after 3 weeks. It's going to take a while. But that's okay, because actually what Via Campesina practices with the idea of food sovereignty is slow politics. This is not politics that gets done like this. It's politics that takes a very long time, and sometimes it can be very difficult and very awkward. I mean, there have been discussions, for example, I was just at Occupy Seattle, but I was there with First Nations people, with indigenous people, and they were saying, well, Seattle was already occupied. The Pioneer Square is this was Muckleshoot land. This land is already occupied, and in fact, what we need to be having is a conversation about moving beyond that. Similarly, in Occupy Wall Street, there was a line in one of the statements saying, we are all one people, we are all one race, we're the human race. And there are lots of people of color going, actually, you know what? That just saying that writes over a great deal of history and exploitation that we want to flag and we want to root out. And so there are these difficult conversations that can be had. And these difficult conversations are difficult. But what Occupy and what food sovereignty offers is a venue and a space and an openness to doing that. And so I guess what I want to do is end with a story about the food system from Malawi that I find incredibly inspirational. That again, I mean, it's about the challenging of power in remarkable ways. In Malawi, those of you who read the foreign policy article will know that there's this big drive towards a green revolution kind of approach to solving hunger in Malawi that involves lots of fertilizer application, a little bit of pesticide, and dealing with the monocultures of corn. And the trouble is that Malawi timed its agricultural buying of fertilizer incredibly badly. So they bought a lot of fertilizer in 2008, at the height of the fertilizer, when fertilizer prices were at the highest ever. And so Malawi, this country of the size of Pennsylvania with 15 million people in it in Africa, landlocked, dirt poor, emptied, it managed to just run out of dollars. I mean, it didn't help that the president at the same time also bought a jet. So there are lots of reasons why the dollar account was run down, but buying fertilizer was a big part of it. And so since then, we've seen protests because there's no money in Malawi now to buy petrol. There's no for gasoline. There's no money for fuel. And so in urban areas, people have been taking to the streets, and the government has been cracking down on those people. And 18 people died in protests earlier on this year as a result of these green revolution sort of technologies being adopted. But in northern Malawi, where the state is not paying such close attention, where the state has systematically starved people of money in large part, there's something something very different going on. And it's a series of experiments in something called the Soils, Food and Healthy Communities Project, where 5,000, actually more than 5,000 farmers are experimenting with different ways of growing food. And they're experimenting, and they're growing different crops together, and they're doing polyculture, about which at some point that'll be covered in the class if it hasn't already, and agroecology, and so you're growing shade. You're growing these leguminous trees that are fantastic. They fertilize the soil, and they provide shade cover, which is terrific because sometimes it gets so hot in Malawi that photosynthesis just shuts down, and actually when you increase shade cover by 15%, yields go up by 15%. And these trees are great because they also provide firewood, so women don't have to go hunting for firewood over there. It just gets brought home. It's really fantastic. And they're experimenting, and they're also growing new kinds of crops that haven't been grown in a generation or two. They're growing things like pearl millet. Pearl millet is something that used to be grown widely, but then got replaced by corn when the British came. The British bringing good things everywhere. So they came with corn, and so people forgot about pearl millet, and now they're rediscovering that pearl millet is much more robust. It's hardier than corn, and particularly in times of climate change, this is a much better system. You've got a portfolio of crops. You've got cowpea, you've got groundnut, you've got pearl millet, and then of course people are cooking together. And that's tremendously important. You have these things called recipe days, in part because people don't know how to cook pearl millet. It's like kale. It's it's a sort of thing that sort of appeared back on the scene, and people are like, well, which is. And so they're sharing recipes. You have 50 families sharing recipes for ways of cooking pearl millet, it's great because it's about food and about people exchanging, and then people start talking about gender. And that's important because these farming systems are doing really well, and they're producing more and more crops. But it's possible for there to be these greater output of crops, more than with fertilizer, and for there to be reduced child nutrition. More crops, yet reduced child nutrition. More crops in the fields, and yet kids are doing worse. Why? Again, it gets back to gender. It gets back to the household. And whose job is it to be harvesting in Malawi? Well, like a number of countries in the global south, it's women. But also women's job to be cooking and cleaning and fetching firewood and fetching water and breastfeeding. And when the cooking still needs to be done, the fetching water and the cleaning, and then there's more harvesting to do, what is it that gives? It's breastfeeding. And so by having these conversations, all of a sudden, women are saying, well, saying to men, look, you're drinking away all the excess money that we get from all of this. Or you're just sitting on your ass. You're not doing anything. And what starts out, what could be within the household, if this happened just at home, this would be a quarrel, right? But when it happens in public, with 50 families around, sharing food, it becomes possible for what was already political to become actually, the personal was always political, but in this space it becomes something that gets acted on. And that transformation actually matters, because now you're starting to see increased levels of nutrition. You can see men helping up around the home. You see women reporting that they're happier with the way things are working. And it's very far from perfect, but it's on a trajectory. It's going to take a very long time. This is slow politics at work. But it's slow politics in exactly the same way as we can see, and as I misrecognized in Wall Street or down in Oakland, but in a range of spaces. And I think that's the sort of promise of the idea of food sovereignty. It's about tackling power wherever it is, whether it's tackling Wall Street for its financial speculations and its complicity in the global food crisis, or whether it's talking about the violence and the inequality and exploitation that happens within the home, or whether it's talking about new ways of growing together and distributing food together, making sure that not only is there more grown, but that everyone gets to eat. That's the great promise of the democracy at the heart of food sovereignty, and that's something that I'm very, very keen that we have much more of. And I think maybe that's a good point in which we should start getting a little bit more democratic by at least having Michael and Nikki up on stage, and then maybe even more democratic by having all yours questions. So thank you.
That was wonderful.
Why, thank you.
Have a seat.
Cheers. Oh, Nikki gets the far left. Of course she does.
It's my prerogative.
It is your prerogative.
We have to share the microphone, right?
Yes.
Oh, where is
I'm
it?
so sorry.
Oh, it's right there. Oh, it's wired. Wow.
Is this yours? And I don't know what I've done. Okay.
Thank you, Raj. That was terrific and entertaining and just as smart as Nikki told us it would be.
Flatter me.
Before I open it, and we will open it right away, I want to just get you to see if you couldn't underscore something that I think was very implicit in your talk, but that I think it would be useful for us to hear. One of the big questions asked of sustainable agriculture, agroecology, is, can it feed the world? And we have this question that's framed in a very specific way that is basically framed as an indictment of the food movement here or anywhere else, because we're going to have a population of somewhere between 8 and 15 million, and we're going to have to dramatically, that implies more people, more mouths, more food. You're suggesting it may not be that simple, but would you talk about the rhetorical uses to which that question is put, and why it perhaps is not the right way to phrase it?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, that's a great question, thank you. I mean, the way in which we think about population, there's always a sort of strain as we get to the 7 billionth person being born, which will happen later on this month. I would urge you to listen out for this sort of, for someone who's doing a lot of thinking for us in the background, and that guy is Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus, the world's first paid economist, was working for the East India Company, the British East India Company, and his main job was to make sure that exploitation happened on time and with profit. But he dabbled also in population, and he did, again, this would be on the PowerPoint if we weren't imaginative enough to be able to do this by ourselves, but you have this idea of population growth. The idea of a Malthusian crash is something that sort of lingers in the back of the minds of many policymakers even today. And just to sort of rehearse that, Malthus had this notion that population, that food, the rate in which we can increase production in food is arithmetic. So it grows up in a sort of steady line like that. But population it grows geometrically, so it goes like that. And at some point, the two intersect, and then all hell breaks loose, because you have a moment where population exceeds food supply. And then what happens? Well, disaster ensues, and you have people running around, and usually the code here is that people who are reproducing and eating are the poor. In fact, it reduces the poor to this, to sort of insatiable genitalia and perpetually sort of grumbling stomachs. They're shagging and eating. That's all they're doing. And so you have this sort of and in a sense, of course, that does a lot of thinking. That did a lot of thinking in thinking about the Cold War's solution to the problem of communism. The governments were very worried in the past about, particularly the US government was worried about, the poor going communist. And so the way to stop that is to make sure that they have enough food. And one of the ways to do that is to invest in these technologies that came to be known as the Green Revolution. It was about improved seed and fertilizer and pesticide and credit for farmers and infrastructural support. But also population control and sterilization. These were all ideas that floated as the same package of the Green Revolution. And this Green Revolution appears to have fed the world. If you look at population growth and Green Revolution technologies, it did the anti-Malthusian thing. I think population growth over the period of the Green Revolution was 112% versus food, which was 178%. So food outgrew population. So it seems terrific. Except, of course, over the same period, particularly if you take China out of the data, you find that there's more hunger. Because again, just thinking about producing more food isn't the answer to making sure that people have the money sufficient to be able to command it. And so, although the Malthusian thing is, and it does a lot of thinking behind our heads. When we're sort of proposed with solutions of how to feed the world, immediately the response seems to be, well, we must produce more food. And yet, right now we have enough food to feed everyone in the world well. The problem right now isn't a problem of distribution. It's a problem of production. It's a problem of distribution. Now, of course, you're right. Then the question becomes, well, do we have enough to feed 10 billion? Do we have enough to feed 15? And the country that I'd look to for that is Cuba. I mean, Cuba has shifted from being one of the second largest importer of fertilizers in the Americas to being a place that embraced agroecology. And they managed through real investment in science and technology, but not genetically modified organisms, but actually robust agroecological science. They managed to get back to where they were with fertilizers and pesticides in almost everything except meat. And with meat, they haven't recovered to where they used to be under the Soviet Union. And I think if we're worried about sort of feeding the world, we need to be thinking not only about changing diets, and certainly eating less meat is going to be on the agenda, but also worrying a lot more about distribution than we do at the moment, because we have plenty of food. And this isn't meat. I mean, I saw an interview, I don't know if you caught this, with the head of Cargill, CEO, and Greg Page, the CEO and chair of Cargill. He was on BBC the other day, and he was saying the same thing as me. I mean, he was saying, look, we live in a time where there are more calories per person than ever before in human history, and the problem is an economic one. He didn't mention that, in fact, his company profits from some of that. But he's right that we actually have the food available. So I think that at the moment we have mechanisms for growing food. We also have proven science to suggest that while the Green Revolution technologies may do well under certain circumstances, with climate change, we actually need much more robust kinds of system. And for those to work, you need the kinds of agroecological system that you've seen approved by reports like the ISTAD report. Not many people will have heard of the ISTAD report. That's because it has the crappiest acronym ever. No one has ever heard of it. But it's the IAASTD, the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development.
He's the only person who knows that.
Yes.
They didn't go to acronym school. The idea is that this is a report that was funded in part by the World Bank and the US government and the British and a range of others, but then wasn't signed onto by these governments. But basically they said, look, actually it is possible for us to grow food in ways that are sustainable, that don't require fossil fuels, which is what the industrial agriculture does, and doesn't require inordinate amounts of water, which again industrial agriculture does. And we have plenty of examples of this being true. I mean, there are studies by Jules Pretty has perhaps one of the best of them. Studies showing that these agroecological models outperform industrial agriculture. Malawi, they're doing 15% better than with fertilizer. You see examples around the world. So that's a long way of saying yes. agroecological agriculture can feed the world, but that's not the only problem. The problem is also one of distribution, and that's something that politically we need to be addressing a lot more. And sadly, the lesson about population and people going hungry is still one that you see. I mean, you even saw it in the Arab Spring. What was the last thing that Ben Ali did in Tunisia before he was chased out? He dropped the price of bread by 30% because he thought, rioting people, the hungry masses, clearly their mouths just need to be plugged with bread, and that's all that needs to happen. But of course, these protests were about much more than hunger. It was all about this desire for change and control that food sovereignty in some ways embodies. And I think that although policymakers still think of the poor as these sort of insatiable and pliant masses who can be shut up with cheap food, what we're seeing is we're in a time where that's just not going to be enough.
Do you have a question, or should we open it up?
Open it up.
Let's open it up. Yeah.
Throughout this class, and you mentioned it today, kind of sidestepping GMOs and just a little bit of demonization. Is it possible for GMOs to augment smaller farming practices, especially for the purposes of developing hardier plants through genetic modification? Not necessarily for the purposes of increasing production, but increasing global production.
The question is it possible that GMOs have a role to play in improving plants, not just for yield, but for other benefits? Great question.
It's a terrific question, and of course the answer is yes. It is possible. Anything's possible. And so the question is, has it? And we've had billions of dollars invested in the industry, and you see it being, widely grown in America, for example, in the United States, pioneering places, and yet yields are pretty much where they were now with pre-GMO crops, and yet farmers continue to plant them. And so we need to ask, well, why do farmers continue to plant them? And one of the major reasons is because it allows farmers to to farm much more and to spray and then forget and get a job off farm. One of the main benefits of genetically modified organisms in the US is that it allows off-farm employment. It facilitates farmers being able to farm and then get a job elsewhere, trucking or doing something else, so that they can keep their incomes up, because farmers are paid so appallingly little in the main, although a few large farms do very well. Small farmers in the US are in general not doing terribly well. So already the track record of GMOs isn't great. But I mean, certainly the people who are against genetically modified organisms sometimes get painted as people who hate science and who want to drag their knuckles on the ground and bring us back to the 19th century. I like food sovereignty, and food sovereignty is about, above all, women's rights, and that's not a 19th century. I mean, that's a 21st century vision of what agriculture should be. And I think that the 21st, there's a correlate there when it comes to thinking about science and agriculture. I think we need a great deal more science in agriculture, and we need ways of making sure that the kind of agriculture we have improves, it works to put carbon back in the soil and works to make sure that there's enough fuel and fiber and all the rest of it. It just strikes me that genetically modified organisms might not be the best for doing that. And again, Cuba is a very interesting example here, because look to the way that scientists had to reinvent themselves there. I mean, scientists in Cuba understand and can do genetic modification, but the laws about using GMOs in Cuba are this: that the Cuban government will let you do that, will let you use GMOs if you can show that there's no better way of doing it, of doing whatever it is that you want to be doing. And that's perfect, because it turns out that every time there's always a better way. That if you want to control pests in a robust fashion, then you can do that by planting, planting the right kinds of flowers around the borders to attract beneficial insects that then maintain an ecological balance. And if you're worried about herbs, not herbs. If you're worried about sort of weeds growing in the wrong places, you can counter that by growing ground crops that shade them out. So you don't need genetically modified crops to be resistant to a herbicide, because you've got this other technology that's actually cheaper and it's more robust. And so I think, and Jeffrey Sachs once was appealing to the similar argument, saying, look, what if we could have a gene for climate change? What if, in the future, we're worried about climate change, everyone's worried about climate change, what if there's a gene for climate change? And you've got to think that that's a slightly nuts thing to say, because climate change, of course, is not just one thing. It's not just about drought tolerance, but it's also about rains at the wrong time, or too much rain, or about a pest you never expected, suddenly finding it a climate that works for it, and so all of a sudden, and so climate change is just a range of different things, and there's no one gene that can do that. And so it seems to me that the one gene, or even if the idea of one gene, one trait weren't already discredited, the idea of just engineering everything you know into one crop does violence, first of all, to the violence, to the knowledge that farmers have. I mean, GMOs are a way of substituting for farmers' knowledge. I mean, they're pitched as the knowledge is in the seed, therefore making farmers' knowledge almost redundant. But what it also moves us towards is monoculture, and it seems to me that the best kinds of insurance against the climate shocks and variability is a portfolio of crops that grow in different lots of different ways, and that's something that that doesn't necessarily involve genetically modified organisms. It does involve science. It does involve the scientists who develop GMOs actually then going into the fields and being accountable for the science. Science in the public interest rather than science for private profit seems to me a good way to go. So I think we need more science, and it is possible that GMOs would be part of that mix. I just haven't seen a convincing argument that they can be.
Yes.
Speaking of science and agriculture, can you talk a bit about public funding for ag research in the U.S.? What's going on with it right now? What are the prospects for getting more public funding for research in agroecological methods? I'm not sure if that's something that you cover, but I think.
I should repeat it for the camera. The question is asking you to discuss public agricultural research and what's going on there.
The prospects aren't great, I have to say, and that's because although we had, and to some extent we can trace this back to Michelle Obama. Because the White House garden advertised itself as an organic garden, and there was an outcry from CropLife, from the pesticide industry. And it was soon after that that one of the executives from CropLife was then appointed to the President's Council of Advisors for trade, right? Yeah. And it just seems to me that there's a battle between the East and West wings of the White House for the soul of agriculture, and it just happens that the East wing has the good food and the West wing has the money, so I mean, in terms of where agricultural funding, there are sort of pots of cash that are available for certain things like farmers markets, and I believe that there's a certain amount for agroecological funding, and you can be sure you can be sure as shit that that's going to be pretty much first up against the wall now that we have the super committee wondering where the axe is going to fall in terms of agriculture, and so there was the Financial Times, I think yesterday or today, was reporting on how there was a strong bipartisan push from Republicans and Democrats in agricultural states to preserve the kind of commodity funding that they've gotten used to and they quite like, but agroecology features nowhere on anyone's agenda who's going to be able to stick their neck out for it, and so my inclination is to think that insofar as federal funding for this kind of thing does exist, it's going to be on the wane, but insofar as universities are important sites for the research for this kind of thing, and already we're seeing less and less of that happening. And Ignacio Chapela, will he be here, or will he be embodied in some way?
He'll be embodied by you.
Okay, I can't channel Ignacio. He's a brain far bigger than mine. But Ignacio Chapela's, for example, he's a soil biologist and stood up against a range of grants that were given to this university, whether it was the I can't remember how it was. 15 million from Syngenta.
I think it was only 5.
Oh, was it 5 in the end? Okay, so $5 million grant that was given by Syngenta, or the $500 million that was given by BP for research on biofuels. And he found himself very precarious. I mean, found himself firstly denied tenure, and then after a big campaign, got tenure in this university. But in many ways, we can see universities being bought up by the private sector for a number of reasons, because a lot of great ideas come from universities like this, but also because universities have different liability requirements from the private sector, and so research that gets done in a university is cheaper to do than a university that's done by the private sector. So I worry about funding for agroecology in the United States, not only because of waning government funding for pretty much anything, but also because of the way the private sector is encroaching on and capitalizing on ideas and great minds in places like this that are being diverted towards the monocultures of the mind.
I would just add one thing to that too, which is one of the problems with, can you hear me? Yeah. With researching agroecological methods is that in an environment where intellectual property drives the research agenda to such an extent, both in universities and out, it's harder to get valuable intellectual property in that approach. It's so much about process, combining a certain kind of tree with a certain kind of crop, rather than producing a powerful seed or a chemical that you can patent and make money on. That money tends to flow, research dollars tend to flow toward the potential for intellectual property, and that puts agroecology at a distinct disadvantage. Somebody on this side, yes? So the question is a big one about economics, and why it doesn't work, and why, how it is you can have, I'm doing a little bit of violence to your question, how it is that you can have a huge surplus over here and a huge demand here, and the two things never meet.
Well, I mean, bear in mind, of course, classical economics, even this idea of equilibrium comes from 19th century physics. I mean, that's where a lot of classical economics today can trace its genealogy, is from 19th century physics, of where you have the world governed by laws, and the atomic individuals floating around trying to behave as if they were governed by laws. I mean, it's sort of a great simplification, but that's the origin of modern economics. Is basically in the 19th century, social scientists wanted something that had the power of physics, and they looked over to physics and they saw equilibrium and supply and demand. They're like, okay, so they saw equilibrium. They're like, we can do that. We can do that with laws, and it'll be great. The trouble is, of course, physics has moved on, and economics is still stuck with that sort of 19th century framework. And even the idea of equilibrium is a sort of, I mean, it's a simplification. But even if equilibrium worked, it works by saying, look, there's a point at which the market will clear, and so there will be a point where we have supply and demand, and they cross here. But there are all these people who have, who would like to buy it at much, much less, but can't afford it. And for those people, well, they're out of luck. Because the way markets, the way you set a price is that's a way of distributing goods. The market is, the market is precisely a way of rationing. And if you have the money, then you get to enjoy that rationing. But if you don't have the money, then you don't, them's the rules of the market. And of course, when it comes to food, the deep injustice is that food is something that everyone needs. It seems like the craziest place to be letting the market reign, when we know that if you don't have food, you die. And yet, of course, we have precisely these arrangements. I mean, that's why in America, where you have more food than people can shake a stick at. I mean, no one would say that America is a country where there's not enough food. And yet, we have 50 million Americans who are going hungry. Why is that? It's not. It's because people are so poor that they can't afford to buy the food that's on the shelves, and that's because it's because of the recession. It's because of the way that we distribute money. It's because of the lack of an entitlement program that's worth a damn. It's because food stamps run out before the end of the month, and it's because people are not able to go back to work. It's because we don't have a healthcare system, so that people are going bankrupt because they can't afford public healthcare. It's a range of reasons that are to do not with the economy, but with the way that we've let the economy trump everything else about our society. That the only way we distribute things is through supply and demand, and we've lost a great deal of our humanity in that process. But that's the short of it, is that it's up to us to figure out whether we want to let the market be the way we distribute food. I mean, and in this country for too long, I think we've chosen to let the market reign and everyone else be damned. And when 50 million Americans are going hungry, that's something that it's time for us to rethink. And again, that's one of the reasons why Occupy and why food sovereignty are very interesting, is because they're saying, well, what we're interested in is equality. And certainly when it comes to food, equality is really important. Not just the equality of being able to eat, but to eat well. And that means income redistribution. And that's something that's, I mean, with income redistribution, it is possible to imagine that, in fact, no one in America would be going hungry. But that's a political decision. That's not about the market.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there are countries out there that are very food secure, and what their systems are like, and why or why not it would be reasonable for America and Europe to sort of copy those things.
The question is, are there countries out there that are food secure, and are these places that we should consider copying?
I mean, levels of hunger in the sort of go-to place is Scandinavia, but the trouble is there's plenty wrong with Scandinavia. There are places with strong safety nets and welfare states. So, for example, when you're out of work, you are still able to access sufficient money to be able to afford health care. Again, it brings us back to the the main reason for personal bankruptcy in the United States, and therefore poverty. It really blew my mind. I was on a panel that was judging applications for backyard gardens in San Francisco, and we got applications from people earning $60,000 a year, and they were like, we need food in our backyards, and we need someone to come and garden for us because actually everyone in the house is disabled. And so we earn $60,000 a year through working on our computers, and all of it goes to the medical companies, and we're broke, and we can't afford to. We can't go out to grow anything. We'd love to grow, but we can't. So can someone come and help us? $60,000 a year, and yet it's about the welfare systems beneath that are utterly failing in this country that one might look at elsewhere. But if you want to look at bang for buck, then Cuba is an interesting place. I mean, in Cuba people are poor, but they're not hungry. And again, that's because of mechanisms to ensure that food is produced locally and regionally. I mean, in Havana, 70% of the food that is eaten in Havana comes from Havana. And that local production system is vital in supporting people. But I mean, it's not just about the food production. There are entitlement mechanisms to make sure that everyone gets to eat. And again, the healthcare system is very good there. The education system is very good there. And so all of a sudden, you have a range of reasons why you can explain why people don't go hungry in one country rather than another. Of course, we also need to be thinking about freedom. We ought to be thinking about the things like land reform. But again, Cuba is very interesting for that. Is that the reason that Cuba looks the way that it does is not because it's a socialist government, but because the people are socialist. Let me explain that a second. It's because after you had the fall of the Soviet Union, the government wanted to carry on with these collectives, and they have this vision of everyone will toil together and it will be great. And it turns out that people are like, no, what we want is land reform. What we want is to be able to have land of our own, and we grow it, and we're going to grow stuff on our land, and we want to be sure that no one's going to take this land away from us. And then we want to know that we can give it to our kids, and we want to know that the state will come and we will have scientists come and work with us in the fields. We don't want them working in the offices over there. We want them to come join us in the fields, and they will work with us. And the people demanded that of the government. And the government was reluctant to be able to accede to this, but in the end they did. And because the people knew how to demand something from the state, they got what they wanted. And I think that's the lesson for us from Cuba, is that when the people know how to demand, they get what they want. And what they got was a system that made them much more food secure. And in many ways, again, we've forgotten how to demand things of our government, and we're only relearning, we're clearing our throats before we make our demands. Clearing our throats may take time, but that's what slow politics is about. So I think, again, we can look to these places for inspiration, but I think we need to build our power here before we can start wishing that good things will happen.
Not all the Cuban demands have been met, though.
No, not at all. I mean, that's
important to point out.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's it is about that. It's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the new trade agreements that were just signed and what that, in regards to food sovereignty, what is that going to mean to food sovereignty in these 3 new countries?
The question is about the new trade agreements that were just signed and what the implications are of those agreements for food sovereignty.
So yes, there were 3 trade agreements signed recently with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, and they were opposed both by farmers groups in those countries, certainly in South Korea, very militantly against Via Campesina groups in South Korea, but also in this country, the National Family Farm Coalition recently expressed their disappointment. Because, again, I mean, it's about this sort of spread of neoliberal ideas of free markets and of allowing corporations to concentrate power more easily. And the concentration of corporate power is of great concern to anyone who wants to think about other ways of doing things. I mean, the concentration of power is not just about corporations being able to set prices and behave badly, but also they get to shape the terrain of the thinkable when it comes to politics and when it comes to alternatives. Which is why I made these jokes about being able to shop in a supermarket and buy the right thing. I mean, corporations will sell us the Diet Coke Plus and the sort of feel-goodery of whatever it is that we want. But it's only in being able to step out of those corporations, out of the boundaries of the supermarket, as Michael has so beautifully and often said about the ways that we can eat. It's only about building the kind of power that people's grocery does, that we can imagine the world differently. And so these particular trade agreements were a loss not only for farmers, for farmers struggling to make ends meet in Korea, whether the beef farmers there or farmers here, but also a more symbolic loss for and a representation of what this particular administration's economic priorities are, which are priorities that lie along the same lines as its predecessors. The Bush administration couldn't get these things passed, but the Obama administration did. And I think that should help us see more clearly where the power lies and the work that the work of organizing and imagination that lies ahead. But luckily, we have the work of organizing and imagination right here that will hopefully help guide us to better things.
Well, Raj, I want to thank you for everything you brought to our class. One of the real takeaways is something that keeps coming up, which is that food is part of a much larger context, and that you don't fix food within food exclusively, that you really have to pay attention to the larger systems, the hourglass that you showed us at the beginning on your faux PowerPoint, and that's I think a really important lesson to take away. So thank you all, and thank you, Raj Patel.